From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Kevin Merida, the national editor at the Washington Post, and we're proud charter sponsors of this festival for the last 11 years, and it's great to be with you. James L. Swanson, the first thing I noticed about his bio is that he was born on February 12th, which happens also to be the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. And so you could say, in a way, that he was destined to write the Edgar Award-winning and New York Times bestseller Manhunt, the 12-day chase for Lincoln's killer, upon which the young reader's version, Chasing Lincoln's Killer, is based. Manhunt was listed by Entertainment Weekly in 2006 as one of the 10 best books of the year, and it was cited in Newsweek as one of the 2 best nonfiction crime books ever written. Truman Capote's In Cold Blood was the other. His latest book, Bloody Crimes: The Chase for Jefferson Davis and the Death Pageant for Lincoln's Corpse, is another Civil War era thriller. It weaves together in riveting fashion the hunt to round up Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, and the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, and the majestic 20-day rolling train funeral that brought Lincoln's body back to Springfield, 1,600-mile journey. James has a degree in history from the University of Chicago, where he was taught by the eminent historian John Hope Franklin, and a law degree from UCLA. He has worked at think tanks and in government here in Washington. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Smithsonian Magazine, and has been active with the Ford Theater here and the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. But what I learned last night at a celebration for the authors at the Library of Congress, and chatting with them, made me like him even more. James Swanson is a lover of writers. And in talking with him and Andrea, they have hosted a lot of book parties. They've, like many of us who like reading, have collected books even when we didn't have shelf space, and stacked them up because they support writers. We were joking about going to book parties, and James always does them really well, he and Andrea, and great food and wine, and for people who come and then they don't buy the books. And we were just lamenting that because we support writers, because that is part of the way we learn about each other. Writing is part of discovery in this great nation and the world, and how we learn about each other. He is a writer who deserves our support. He's a beautiful writer, and he will also be signing his books from 2 to 3 p.m. So without further delay, let me introduce to you James L. Swanson. Give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Kevin, for that kind introduction. Last night, one thing Kevin told me that he didn't mention to you, he gave me a dire warning about the dangers of collecting books. I have over 3,000 books at our house in Washington. My wife, who's an economics professor, must have 1,000 books just on her subjects. And Kevin warned me of a book fanatic whose house literally exploded from the weight of the books on the support beams. And beneath this pile of books was found the dead body of the crazed collector of these books. And so I'm getting a little worried, because we do have a library room at home, and in that room are 2,000 books alone, and I think I'm going to call an engineer over to look at that room, because I don't want the house to explode. This is the third time I've spoken at the festival, and I see some of you, I've seen you before at this festival, so if you've heard me speak before, you know that one thing I don't like to do is do a reading from the book. I go to a lot of book events myself, and I get a little bored if someone just reads from the book, because I think, well, I could do that myself. I want to hear about things that aren't in the book, like who they are, how they got started, what they're interested in, what they learned from doing the book, what surprised them about doing the book. Have they been threatened by any members of the public for doing the book? I'll get to one of those. And so I thought I'd talk a little about how I did this 2 books, which really are a trilogy of stories, and how I got into this, and how I do these books. And then I'll talk about what I think my favorite themes are in the Bloody Crimes book, and what it means at this time of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. I had not planned to write about Abraham Lincoln and the assassination. There were other books I wanted to do. When my agent said, "What do you want to do next?" I said, well, when I was a boy, my grandmother was a great storyteller. She worked for the old Chicago tabloid newspapers at the end of that Ben Hecht age, the Chicago Sun, the Times, the Sun-Times, the Daily News. And when I was little, she would tell me sometimes horrific stories. And I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old, she said, "Did you know that during the World's Fair of 1893, an insane doctor murdered 100 girls and dissolved their bodies in acid?" Well, I was 8 or 9. And so I told my agent, when I was a boy, my grandmother told me, and he said, "She told you that when you were a little boy?" And I said, "Yes, I want to do that book." And he said, "Well, unfortunately, do you know who Eric Larson is?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I happen to know he's halfway finished writing a book, which is going to be called Devil in the White City, so you can't do that." Well, then I said, well, when I was a boy, my father told me a great story. He went to Lane Tech High School in Chicago during World War II, and the teachers would point to a desk and say, "At that desk sat Herbert Hans Haupt, one of 8 Nazi saboteurs landed by Nazi U-boat on the shores of New Jersey in 1942 to do sabotage, and then he was executed. But he lived in Chicago and assimilated very much." And I'd always thought about that story. And then my first day working at the Department of Justice during the Reagan administration, my office was on the 5th floor, the Attorney General's floor, with all that great WPA art and paintings and sculptures. And there was an interesting thing on the wall opposite my office was a bronze plaque that said, "In this room were tried the 8 Nazi saboteurs." So I called my dad and said, "You're not going to believe it. The Nazis were in the office right across from me, and that's where they were put on trial." So I told my agent that story. I said, "I want to write about the 8 Nazi saboteurs." And he said, "Well, the good news is there is no author out there." This was shortly after September 11th, when there was great resurgence of interest in terrorism and bombings and attacks on America. He said, "The good news is there is not an author out there who's in the middle of writing a book on the Nazi saboteurs. There are 3 authors simultaneously writing 3 books on the same subject. So you have to give that up." Then I said, well, I remember when I was a little boy, my grandfather, who was on the Chicago police force from the 1930s, the Al Capone era, to the late 1960s, the civil rights protests and the anti-Vietnam War protests, told me many wild stories. One day I remember he came home, and I heard him do a whisper to the family, "Don't let Jamie read the newspaper tonight." So, of course, the 6 or 7-year-old curious boy that I was, I had to read the Sun-Times. And so I read the headline, "Madman Slaughters 9 Student Nurses with Knife." You might remember, some of you might remember the name of Richard Speck, the notorious murderer. And I researched him, and he was such a horrible man. And it was such a sad and unredeeming story. It caused my agent to say, "Do you want to spend the next 2 years of your life with Richard Speck?" And I said, "No." And I said, "Well," he said, "What else have you got?" And I said, "Well, Abraham Lincoln was the first president ever murdered, and there was an amazing 12-day chase for his killer. And then there's a story about," and he said, "Wait a minute, go back to that thing about the Manhunt." And he said, I bet people would read that book." So that's how I came to the subject. And I planned to do just the Manhunt book. That was going to be my take on the end of the Civil War. But then, when I finished the book, it occurred to me that Manhunt, or the chase for John Wilkes Booth, was only one of 3 great stories that marked the spring of April 1865. The second was Abraham Lincoln's last journey that he undertook in death. the funeral in Washington, of course, but then that great 1,600-mile railroad journey that took his body through all the great cities of the North, where it was unloaded from the train, put on public display as he lay unburied for 20 days between the time he was shot and he got home to Springfield. Undertakers and embalmers were put on the train because he was decomposing along the way. 1 million people viewed his corpse, including 100,000 children viewed him. 7 million watched the train go by. So that was the second journey. And then the third journey was very little known, and that was of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States, who, like Lincoln, near the end of the war, left his White House and went on his 6-week journey to try to save the Confederacy. He wasn't trying to save himself. If he did that, he could have easily escaped to Mexico or to Europe or to Cuba. But he didn't want to save his own skin. He wanted to save his country and his cause. And I'm convinced that these three journeys of Booth, of Lincoln, and Davis are as important as any of the great American journeys, whether it's the journey of Lewis and Clark, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, even the journey to the moon. Because these three journeys at the end of the Civil War really set in motion myths that live today and affect how we remember the war, what issues we still face that came out of the Civil War. And so I decided to do Bloody Crimes as the sequel or follow-up to Manhunt, and tell all three of the stories. I thought of doing the books separately. I thought about doing one book on the Lincoln funeral train, the embalming at the White House, the autopsy there. But I decided to combine them for two reasons, some of which I'll get to in a moment. The uncanny and even bizarre similarities between the life stories of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis made me want to tell their stories together. And secondly, I was already in somewhat of a gloomy mood after I'd finished Manhunt. Because what is it but an American tragedy of death and sadness and possibilities of what might have been? I wasn't sure I could handle two more books about American assassinations and death and tragedy. So I decided to combine the stories into one. It really didn't help me because I've agreed for the fall of 2013 with my publisher to publish a book on the assassination of President Kennedy for the 50th anniversary. So I'm still going to be on that theme. I did Bloody Crimes the way I did Manhunt. I try to tell my stories the way a novelist would, but with everything being true. I try to tell the story in real time as it happened, because people living then didn't know on day one what was going to happen the next day. They didn't know in the first week what was going to happen the second week. And so I try to keep the reader in suspense, even though you do know the outcome. Abraham Lincoln dies. Jefferson Davis doesn't win the Civil War. But I try to get the reader to imagine what it might have been like to be living then, to read about those things in the newspaper day by day, or to be involved in those things. The other technique I use is I try to always have in my hands original things. I like to hold the original Civil War newspaper, the original photograph, not the microfilm. I like to look at the artifacts or go to the places. I've visited Ford's Theater over 100 times. I visited Jefferson Davis's grave in Richmond, his office in the Confederate White House. I went to the tomb at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown, where Abraham Lincoln's little son Willie was buried after he died in the White House. And there I discovered that during the Civil War, to visit Willie Lincoln's tomb, Abraham Lincoln had to walk right past the grave of Jefferson Davis's infant son. When I write about the Laura Keene's theatrical costume stained by Lincoln's blood, I do that when I'm actually holding in my hands a piece of that blood-stained fabric. Or when I write about Lincoln's lock of hair clipped after he died by Secretary of War Stanton and given as a gift to the wife of the Secretary of the Navy, I'm looking at that lock of hair as I'm writing about it. So those are some of the techniques I use. So even though I was born on Lincoln's birthday, Bloody Crimes is really my swan song for now to the Lincoln theme. It's funny, my dad said to me, thank goodness we had you on Lincoln's birthday. You've done Manhunt, Chasing Lincoln's Killer, the kids' book, Bloody Crimes, the kids' book of Bloody Crimes. My wife and I have just finished a book for our children's publisher, Scholastic, on Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg. My father said, just imagine if I didn't have you on Lincoln's birthday, what if you'd been born on Grover Cleveland's birthday? Or even worse, what if you were born on Hitler's birthday? What would you have become? What would you have written about? But that did not happen. I want to talk a little bit about Lincoln and Davis and who they were and their commonalities. I want to begin by saying I was much more of a Lincoln person and expert when I began the book, and I learned a lot about Jefferson Davis during the book. And I want to say this about him. Jefferson Davis is truly one of the lost men of American history. We know the name, probably, and I found that no one knows anything about him. No one reads biographies of him. No one reads his 2-volume memoirs. In fact, I was at the Decatur, Georgia Book Festival a few weeks ago, and 300 people had gathered in a church to hear my talk on the book. And I said, I'm just curious, because I'm in the heart of the South, how many people in this room have read the memoirs of Jefferson Davis? And one man in 300 people raised his hand. And I said, how many people in this room have read a biography of Jefferson Davis? And 5 or 6 people out of 300 had read a book. And that's in a region of the country that's very interested in history, very knowledgeable about the Civil War. So that was really my great surprise. Here are some of the things that link them. Both men born in Kentucky in log cabins, less than 100 miles apart and less than 1 year apart. In their youth, both men were undisciplined, fun seekers. When Jefferson Davis was at West Point, he was almost expelled on more than one occasion from the academy for drinking at Benny Haven's Tavern, a forbidden place of debauchery for the cadets. He almost fought a duel, as did Abraham Lincoln, almost once fought a duel. Both were excellent wrestlers. As a boy, Jefferson Davis had learned from slaves how to wrestle, and Abraham Lincoln became an expert wrestler in New Salem, where he fought many matches with the Clary's Grove boys. And Lincoln, always rail thin, had prodigious strength from his years of physical labor. That's where they diverged as youths. Jefferson Davis was privileged. He had an older brother who educated him, sent him to academies and then to West Point. We forget this about Abraham Lincoln. From the time he was a young boy, Abraham Lincoln was worked as hard by his father as many American slaves were actually worked on plantations. When Lincoln was 9 years old, he was handed a full-size adult rail-splitting axe. He would work from dusk till dawn, splitting rails, chopping trees, doing manual tasks. Lincoln's hatred of slavery began when he was a boy, when he really considered himself his own father's slave, and he vowed that somehow he was going to rise from those humble origins, and he would not spend the rest of his life working in that way. Lincoln and Davis had very similar mental processes. They were both men of reason and restraint and thoughtfulness. They weren't hotheads. Lincoln never acted rashly when he was president. Jefferson Davis began the secession crisis by being anti-secession. He thought it was a bad idea the South would secede. He was not with the radical fire eaters who gave no heed to the possible consequences of the war. So Davis was not at all a crazed radical abolitionist. They shared experience in the military. Lincoln as a humble elected captain of volunteers in the Black Hawk War in Illinois and Wisconsin. Jefferson Davis as an officer in the regular army. And they suffered in their youth an almost identical tragedy that seared them and changed them and made them different men. Lincoln and Davis, in full adulthood, were brooding, melancholy men often. And they had a very fatalistic view of things. And I think this is how it began. In the case of Jefferson Davis, Her name was Sarah Knox Taylor, or Knox. She was the daughter of General Zachary Taylor. Jeff met her when she was 17 or 18 years old. They fell in love. The Taylors didn't want them to marry because they didn't want her to live the tough life of an Army officer's wife on the western frontier. They corresponded. Then, 2 years later, after they'd not seen each other for 2 years and only had written letters, Davis resigned from the Army so he could marry her. He took her home to Mississippi and then to his sister's plantation, and there both fell ill from a particularly virulent form of malaria that had been brought to the South by slaves from Africa more than 2 centuries before. Strange, almost a kind of vengeance upon those who had enslaved them. Davis and Knox were very sick, delirious, almost died. Davis recovered enough to crawl from his bed when he heard Knox singing in her delirium her favorite song. And as he went to her bed and held her in his arms, she died. And she was 21 years old, and they had been married for 12 weeks. He then went into what he called, I quote, "my great seclusion," close quote, where for 7 years he was secluded on his plantation with his slaves, his overseer, and his brother who had the plantation next door. Eventually, he returned to the world again when he met Verena Howell, a girl from a Mississippi family. She wasn't so thrilled to first meet him. She wrote to her mother the next day, "I've met Mr. Davis. Mother, I think he might be as old as you are. And his manner offends me deeply. He seems certain of his opinions and will not think that anyone can be right about something. And yet, there is something about him." In the case of Abraham Lincoln, her name was Anne Rutledge. And I apologize to any of the Mary Lincoln fans who might be in the audience. But Mary Lincoln and her apologists have, for the past 170 years, tried to deny what I think the truth is about Abraham Lincoln and Anne Rutledge. The villagers saw it in New Salem, the long walks together, the conversations at the little store that Lincoln helped operate, handing her letters for her family at the post office where he worked. The villagers recognized the familiar signs of courtship. Anne had been engaged to a man, a ne'er-do-well. He vanished, claiming he'd come back to claim her, but he never did. And so many scholars believe that there was something between them and something might have ultimately happened permanently between them. It was not to be. Anne took sick and died suddenly, and Abraham Lincoln was bereft. His friends actually confiscated his razors because they feared that Abraham Lincoln would commit suicide over the death of Anne Rutledge. We have no pictures of her. Photography was in its infancy then, and who would have thought to paint a sketch or do a portrait of some poor illiterate girl on the western frontier? In fact, that's one of the few things, the only piece of physical evidence that still links them. At the Library of Congress, there's a copy of Kirkham's Grammar. And on the title page of that book, there is this inscription: Anne Rutledge is now learning grammar. That inscription is in Abraham Lincoln's handwriting. He was teaching Anne how to read. The only description of her that survives comes from a brother of hers that says she was fair and had blue eyes. And that tragedy changed them. And later in life, they experienced identical twin tragedies again that I'll mention in a moment. Another thing they had in common, they were criticized, demonized, bedeviled by their own people when they were in power. They were constantly tortured by their generals, by their cabinet members who were their rivals, who schemed against them, vicious newspaper criticisms. Politicians today say, oh, it's so tough, politics should be more civil. How can this be? The vicious things that we say. We have it easy today compared to the era of Lincoln and Davis. Politicians today are absurdly thin-skinned compared to the criticisms leveled against politicians going back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. I think it's perhaps today because not enough of our leaders read and know our history to realize that American politics was much more rude and vicious and critical in past centuries than it is today. Another interesting thing, both laid their heads on their pillows, just as they had been born, less than 100 miles apart. Their White Houses, now 100 miles apart. Each went to bed in his White House, dreaming and plotting to defeat each other's nation and to win. During the Civil War, they suffered another set of tragedies. In February 1862, Lincoln's favorite son, 12-year-old Willie, died in the White House. Lincoln was crushed. No one in Washington knew about Anne Rutledge. Well, Mary Lincoln did, but she didn't want to hear about it. Lincoln never discussed Anne. He never wrote about her. But the death of his son sent him back 30 years to that same feeling of loss and devastation. It really made Lincoln, who was very empathetic anyway, empathize with all the dead of the Civil War. And in fact, if you read his letter to Fannie McCullough, which I quote in Bloody Crimes, which is by far, in my opinion, the single most beautiful letter that Abraham Lincoln ever wrote in his life. It's written to a young girl whose father was killed in battle, and Lincoln knew the man. You must read that letter. That letter, Lincoln was writing to himself in that letter and to the American people. In the case of Jefferson Davis, one of his little boys fell to his death from the balcony at the Confederate White House. Davis received word at his office. He rushed home, only to hold his son in his arms for a few minutes. The boy's skull was crushed, bones were broken, and as he held his boy in his arms, the boy died, which sent Davis back 30 years to the death of his beloved Knox. So they're both brooding men. Davis was once more famous than Abraham Lincoln. Secretary of War, senator, congressman, war hero, wounded in battle. Abraham Lincoln, but an unsuccessful one-term congressman from Illinois. If you had once asked Americans in the late 1850s, who do you predict will be a future president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis? The majority of Americans would have said Jefferson Davis, and a number would have said Abraham who? Because until the late spring and summer and fall of 1858, during those Lincoln-Douglas debates for the Illinois Senate seat, Abraham Lincoln was not a famous national figure. He was rising in popularity because of his anti-slavery views, but he was not the national figure that Davis was. One wonders what would have happened if the Democratic Party did not split in 1860 and Abraham Lincoln ran only against Jefferson Davis. One wonders at the possible outcome of that election. I'll turn to their final journeys now and the great difference between them and the great thing they had in common. The great difference, of course, was on who is man, what is the nature of man. Abraham Lincoln once said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. Jefferson Davis believed that slavery was right. He had grown up with it, he was raised into it, and he fought a war in part to defend it. That forever separates the vision of America of Lincoln and Davis. Equal rights for all under the law, or unequal rights for some under the law. They do have a very frightening thing in common. And I say this not negatively or as a criticism, I just say it as a fact. The two greatest killers in American history are named Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln. Each man was willing to send his country to fight to the death to vindicate their cause. At least 620,000 men died in the Civil War. A new report coming out soon says it might be up to 750,000. 340,000 Union, 200-something thousand Confederate. I'm absolutely convinced that Lincoln and Davis would have sent 1 million men each to their deaths. In Lincoln's case, to vindicate the principles of free elections and liberty and union. In the case of Davis, states' rights, limited government, and the right to secede and the right to own slaves. And that's why, ultimately, that's the fundamental thing they have in common. Abraham Lincoln has come down in myth as kindly Father Abraham, who always sought compromise. Politicians today say we should be like Lincoln, we should compromise, we should negotiate. Once Lincoln decided that a principle was correct, rather than compromise, Abraham Lincoln would order your death. He would send those armies forward. He felt terrible about it, as did Davis. They felt tremendous guilt and responsibility for sending the best men of their nations to fight and die. But that's how committed to their principles they were. Their final journeys, I'll just touch on that briefly. The funeral journey of Lincoln was, I believe, the most intense, emotional public event in American history to this day. If you want to get a sense of that emotion, remember, if you will, if you were living then, the reaction of the nation to the murder of President Kennedy, the murder of Dr. King, of Robert Kennedy. Remember your reaction to 9/11. Then amplify those emotions to get some sense of what it was like to be living in America when that train was taking Lincoln home. In the case of Jefferson Davis, his journey was of a different kind. He was on the 6-week escape. His entourage, several thousand, several hundred, then his wife and small children and 20 or 30 guards, captured, imprisoned, released after 2 years, as Lincoln would have wanted. But then Jefferson Davis went on to live a strange afterlife, almost a quarter century after the Civil War. He became in time the living symbol of the lost cause. He encouraged scholarship, the formation of Southern historical societies, letters. He wrote his memoirs. Davis really was galvanized by the death of Robert E. Lee in 1870. Lee had wanted to write his memoirs, but he died too soon, and Davis said, "It occurs to me, before I am pulled into the grave, to write a history of the struggle of our people." And he did just that. Davis was at the peak of his reputation in 1886. Over 20 years after the Civil War. Like Lincoln, he was a greater hero in the South after the war, as Lincoln was a greater hero after he died. Davis went on a triumphant speaking tour. He went to Alabama and elsewhere to dedicate statues to the war dead. And Davis gave the most important speech of his life in Alabama in 1886. I call it the seed corn speech, when he looked over this vast audience of tens of thousands of people. Old women dressed in black touched him and collapsed at his feet and passed out. Old soldiers, amputees wearing old uniforms, laid hands on him and they began trembling uncontrollably and they could not speak. And then he said, "I remember those days. I remember those boys. Their rifles and the packs in their backs weighed more than those boys." He's referring to the 14 and 15-year-olds who were in the Confederate Army in the last year and the last months of the war. Many of the parents of these dead young men were in the audience. And then Davis said these magical words, "But they are not dead. They were the seed corn of the South," implying a crop that never grew to maturity. The audience rose up in a furor, and the New York Times and other reporters said, "We've never heard human beings scream and cheer that loudly. Who knows where this will end? The South is aflame." Well, it ended 3 years later in 1889 when Davis died in New Orleans. And then later, Varina decided his body should go home, not to Mississippi, his home, but to Richmond, where he could reign forever as a symbol of the lost cause. 100,000 people attended the Lincoln funeral events in Washington. 300,000 people attended the Davis events, and then later the erection of his monument. On the day he died and then was taken to Richmond, his partisans believed that Jefferson Davis's name, just like Abraham Lincoln's, would go down forever in history as a great American hero. Of course, we know that did not turn out to be. The 20th century came to belong to Abraham Lincoln and his cause of liberty and equal rights. No better illustration of this were in two important dates. We all remember February 2009, the 200th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. A White House dinner, pre-birthday dinner hosted by George and Laura Bush, the first dinner ever held in Lincoln's honor in the White House. Stamps, coins, books, symposiums, movies. How many of you marked June 3rd, 2008, the 200th birthday of Jefferson Davis? There were no coins, there were no stamps, no major symposiums, no avalanche of books, certainly no dinner at the White House celebrating the birthday of Jefferson Davis. And I'll close by saying, the Civil War is very controversial. We know that. We know the governor of Virginia got in hot water a year ago for proposing that there be a Confederate History Month. We know that some people oppose celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. To them, I would say this. All of it is American history. And I think it's very important at this 150th anniversary year. If you're going to study Abraham Lincoln, you must study Jefferson Davis. If you're going to study the white man of the Civil War, you had better study the black man and study the slaves, the free men, and the men of color, 200,000 of them who joined the Union Army. If you're going to study the women of the North, study the women of the South. And the only way to understand this rich tapestry and to understand its meaning then and how it still affects us today is to know all of the Civil War and know all of its history. And that's what, in some small way, I've tried to do in these books. So thank you very much. And I think there's a little time for a few questions. Someone needs to turn on your microphone.
It's on now. Oh, it is? Oh.
Yes.
I would just like to first say that I read your kids' edition of Manhunt, and it was featured in my school, and I think that's what really got me interested in history and really got me interested in the Civil War and everything like that. So just thank you for doing that for me.
Thanks. Well, that was my first children's book, to do Chasing Lincoln's Killer based on Manhunt. And you might know I've done another children's book on the sequel to Manhunt, but I didn't know how to do children's books. I thought it would be easy, and then I quickly learned how hard it is. I did get some advice from our boys who said, remember this. One boy said, readers want blood. And then the other boy said, and knives, lots of knives. And if you've read my books, you know that there's blood and knives. So, but thank you for saying that.
So my question is, in your book, I really liked it because it didn't seem like history. It seemed more like a fiction book. So my question to you is, what are some elements and some things that you did to make it seem more like drama than history?
Well, yeah, how did I make it more like drama than history? First, as I said, I try to keep it in the strict timeline of the order of what happened, the way people actually would live their lives or experience a historical event. Then I try very much to describe where things happened. You know, what season was it? What room did it happen in? What was the wallpaper on the room? What time was it? Who was there? What was it like when Booth was in that pine forest? What was the temperature? What did the diaries and newspapers and memoirs and trial transcripts say what people said? And use their exact words, and don't paraphrase and don't make things up. So it's kind of like a time capsule where I try to surround you with everything that someone living then might have seen or experienced. So that's one way I try to do it. Thank you. Yeah.
What was the U.S. government official position or stand on chasing for Jefferson Davis, and who was getting paid to chase him? And how did Lincoln and Andrew Johnson differ in their view of Davis?
Well, what was the hunt for Davis like? How did it begin? Abraham Lincoln did not want to hunt down Jefferson Davis. During his last cabinet meeting, Lincoln said about the top Confederates, let them go. I don't care. Lincoln told General Sherman in so many words during their last conference, if they just go. Lincoln did not order the rest of any Confederate generals. He didn't want to try them. He didn't want to execute them. Lincoln preferred that they relieve him of the problem by escaping, but he didn't want to try them or execute them. Unfortunately, when Lincoln died, one of Jefferson Davis's lifelong enemies, Andrew Johnson, became president. Johnson and Davis despised each other for years. And so Davis announced a $100,000 reward. Johnson introduced a $100,000 reward and named Jefferson Davis as one of the Lincoln assassins, which was false. Davis was not involved in the murder, but he was going to be accused of treason. The reward was paid to men of a cavalry unit who happened to chase Davis down. Booth, detectives, civilians, army, everybody was hunting for Booth. But Davis had gotten so far into the Deep South, only the Union cavalry was after Davis, and every penny of that reward was paid out to the men who had captured him.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your talk. Many years ago, I went to the Jefferson Davis house, and I went to see the outbuilding where he wrote his memoirs. And I had a question for myself, and you just partially addressed it, is how did Jefferson Davis live to write his memoirs? What were the people, especially the people of the North, you said the people of the South were coming to see him. What did the people of the North think of him while he was traveling around the South and having these speeches and attracting these people?
To many people, Davis was a hated figure, but that hatred seemed to recede shortly after the war. When the false rumor spread, he was captured in women's clothing, he was ridiculed. That took away some of the hatred. Most people ignored him, because right after the war, he didn't go on a speaking tour. He didn't run for office. He said, if I would take the oath of loyalty to the Union, I could be elected to any political office in the South. But I won't take that oath. And Davis said, if we were right then, how can I say we were wrong now? And so he wasn't thought of. He didn't speak out. He was not an agitator in the mistreatment of blacks after the war. He just remained silent. He could have made it better for the freed slaves. He chose not to, but he was also not a leader of the Klan or that sort of thing. He became a fascinating figure. Even Oscar Wilde visited him. The North didn't think much about him, but the South revered him.
How did Jefferson Davis's memoirs stack up as reading matter? How was he as a writer?
Jefferson Davis's memoirs do not stack up great as reading matter. They're 2 volumes, extremely long. He was not as good a writer as Abraham Lincoln. And also, he didn't open his heart in these memoirs. He was a taciturn private man, and he wrote more about legal justifications for secession. There's a multi-100-page section of the book about the history and right of secession. So it was more of a political book and a legal book. You don't find the real Jefferson Davis in those memoirs. You find them in his multi-volume collected works of his letters and speeches and that sort of thing. The memoirs are a tough read. I'm told that was the last question, so thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.